Okay, today I'm going to talk about the Gospel of Thomas, which was found in Egypt after the Second World War in Nag Hammadi. And it's a text the Church Fathers refer to in a very derisory way, but we've only been able to read it recently in its entirety. The translation will be one based on an Element publisher's version, which I read in the early 90s, and transcriptions of which I have in this formerly read diary, which I made in 1991 after being introduced to the Gospel of Thomas by Sandy Rich in the University Library of Durham. Thanks for that, Sandy. And I'm not going to consider questions too much of, well, not at all, in fact, about how it came about, how it came to be published, and that. Just respond to some of its content. Okay, so, blessed is the lion which becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man. So here we have lion, man, and consuming, the process of consumption. So if we think about the lion as the passions and as materiality, that's what I'd like to do, and if we talk about man as both a combination of reason and spirit, or reason and will, but man is just also in the sense of agency, then the man, in both cases the lion becomes a man, yeah? But in the first case, the process whereby which the lion becomes the man is one where the lion is consumed by the man consumes the lion. So there's a sense in which human agency or human reason or control is in touch with the process of becoming passionate, becoming material, or being in touch with those kind of animal passions, these wild passions, but appropriating them in a regularized way, harmonious way. Whereas the way that is, as it were, cursed by Jesus, or the negative way, would be that way in which still the lion becomes the man, but here the lion is dominant and overcomes the selfhood and agency of man through passions and through materiality. I have cast fire upon the world, and see, I am guarding it until it blazes. Difficult one, very mysterious. We could ask again the question, to what extent at different times is Jesus being figurative, in what other times is he being metaphorical or figurative? Fire, I would suggest here, this means love, and the love of the Holy Spirit, and I'm guarding it until it blazes. So what I think of this in terms of this fire being new, that was brought into the world and manifested first after his death at Pentecost, but also during his life, of course, in his own ministry. And this fire of universal love between human beings is guarded insofar as it's associated with Jesus Christ in his heavenly ascented phase. He's not walking the earth today, for example. He's gone. Okay? He's guarding it through the church. And it's sort of sadly, that there needs to be a church, as Jesus, I think, says to Peter, I must build my church, So there will come a time, in other words, when it no longer needs to be guarded. And I would suggest this will be a time of post-religious, a genuinely post-religious time, not a post-religious time wherein, in God's absence, we have also destroyed religion, but rather precisely because God is everywhere, there is no need for religion. Okay? And this makes me think of what Paul says about the Father being all in all. And then the love of the Holy Spirit will be everywhere. Okay? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you become two, what will you do? Or is it when you became two, what will you do? Interesting here, assertion of an original unity. You might expect that from a spiritual theist. Then the acknowledgement of fragmentation, that we have now a condition of life of two-ness or multiplicity. Nothing particularly unusual there. What was interesting, though, however, is the assertion of human blame in the process of fragmentation, you became two. So I didn't split you up, you became two. That's the thing I have to be careful about, because that's how I lost my last recording, so I don't know what was going on there. Okay. So you became two, but when you become two, what will you do? So how do people become two? Well, I would suggest, as I said earlier in my talk on Eden, by way of accusation and the rising up of a dark heart through the knowledge, my understanding of the knowledge of good and evil. So now that we are two, what will you do? In other words, well, there's one option. We can enjoy our multiplicity, we can enjoy the fragmented nature of our world, or we can and do nothing about that, or we can not enjoy it and think about how to get back to the original one. And then we can perhaps fail in this, or perhaps this is a call to certain humility and piety and receptivity to God, to the divine transcendent. Interesting question we have at the moment in philosophy, in continental philosophy, is the status of the one versus the multiple. And there seems to be a very strong presumption and fashion at the moment in favour of multiplicity against the one, and a fear of the one, a dread of the one. And I totally understand this, but this is what I would call the Neoplatonic or Aristotelian and Neoplatonic one of power and oppression, as Badiou says. So the question is, can we have a different sense of the one? And I've written a dialogue about this. Can we have a different sense of the one? Which is a good one, a better one. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out. So intoxication, implication here being, I suppose, that intoxication is a bad thing, but Jesus has measured it out. So because Jesus has measured out, it's presumably understood here to be a good thing. So what you've got going on perhaps here is a question: have they drunk too much? I mean, have they listened to too much of what Jesus has had to say? So is Jesus giving too much, or is it not so much the sense that you've drunk too much, but that you're not accustomed to Jesus's beverages, as it were, or Jesus' words, because you're not used to this kind of light, and because you've had this little, you've seen it, it's blown you away, it's wiped you out in a sense, because it's so extraordinary, because it's so rare. So the implication could be here that it's because we're living on the wrong level of being in our natures that we find this invocation of love so strange, or this message of light so strange, which reminds me of my talk with Tim and Chomps and about the content of Lost Christianity, book by Jacob Nidelman, where they're speaking about the need for, the book is Lost Christianity, speaking about the need for an intermediate Christianity where we need to change the level of our beings so that we are able to actually receive this light. And that also reminds me, as I say about Chomps and Tim, where we talked about praying to be able to pray. And of course, for me, Gurdjieff would come in here. The question is not, are you a Christian or not, but how is it possible to be a Christian? The difficulty of being a Christian, in other words, loving your enemies. I mean, is anyone a Christian in that sense? And the point hidden within this is it's not just in a certain abstract intentionality to love everyone that is in question here, but the ability to actually do it. It's difficult. But anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. I shall give you what no eye has seen, and what no ear has heard, and what no hand has touched, and what has never occurred to the human mind. One could wonder whether that was actually the case, maybe, but that would depend on what Jesus was talking about. But the idea for me, what I take from this text is there is a certain possible mode of human reality and engagement subjectively and collectively of a kind that is so mystically other and yet at the same time so familiar that perhaps it's unimaginable to people. And it's really just love and the reconciliation of people with everyone else in a non-boring way. But the ability to sustain that love in this material dimension without conflict, significant conflict. But we're also reminded here of mystical vision of the infinite and the finite that Blake talks about. Or you can just take from this that we're talking about something specifically very new here. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the female and the male, or rather, sorry, the male and the female one and the same, and when you fashion eyes in place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then you will enter the kingdom. So again, this idea that we can make the two into the one, or rather we had made the one into the two. So the call for us to return the two to the one, that this is something that we need to do even if we need God's help. So when we make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, which could be a combination of a lack of hypocrisy, a lack of concealment, a lack of deceit, but also a bringing into the public domain of the intimacies and richness and authenticities of private life, I would also suggest. And the above like the below, when you make the above like the below, that's interesting because that's kind of like a reversion of making the below like the above, yeah, which is a hermetic principle of as above so below. But maybe Jesus is not talking about making heaven more earthly, although in a sense you could suggest it's that if we consider that heaven, that our notions of spirituality have been perhaps constructed by an immateriality, by a lack of finitude. So if we make our notions of spirituality more finite, even though infinite, but finite in their modes of contingency and everydayness, so if we can make our spirituality more materialistic, making the above like the below, and when you make, or it could be talking in a sense of structures of power in politics, when you make the king like the pauper, or when you make the king like the ordinary person, or the ruler like the slave. And when you make the male and the female one and the same, I would suggest this is not some kind of hermaphroditism, but rather a notion of androgyny, whereby, in a sort of Jungian sense, each person, male or female, is reconciled within themselves, within their soul, within their psyche, to the principle of the other gender, such that each person is not quite so sort of bereft in their being of the other principle, so that we actually are dependent on the other gender less, which I then think will create much greater harmony between the genders. It's a big issue, so I'll just leave that there. And when you fashion eyes in place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and the like. So when you fashion eyes in place of an eye, so when you acknowledge that there are many different ways of seeing things, perhaps, or that also in the same way they're also interchangeable in their difference. And a hand in place of a hand, I think this is the idea, and again, a foot in place of a foot and a likeness in place of a likeness. I think for me this is this sense that we can see commonality in difference. So that in different hands and different foots in different places we see the same thing, even though it's different. So we feel a sense of oneness across and in the differences, which is the perception of love. Then you will enter the kingdom, which, as he says elsewhere, is already spread out across the earth, but men do not see it. Perhaps. Love your brother like your soul, guard him like the pupil of your eye. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Brother, although for me would mean everyone, but not for some people. For empty they came into the world, and empty too they seek to leave the world. Kind of sad reflection on people's lack of interest in genuinely kind of working on their essence and developing attributes of richness in themselves that could never be taken from them because they're part of their developed essence. Talk about the difference between personality and essence. When you disrobe without being ashamed, and take up your garments and place them under your feet like little children, and tread on them, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and you will not be afraid. So I like this notion that fear is not a good thing, and the promise that at the moment of this uncovering, unconcealment, there will be no fear. But it's interesting exactly why. So obviously, take off your robes and be unashamed, such that you were in the Garden of Eden before you knew the knowledge of good and evil, and accusation, which sees shamefulness where it doesn't necessarily belong. Take up your garments and place them under your feet like little children, and not actually, I think, little children, not actually becoming little children, but like little children, with this sort of second innocence I talked about earlier, not the original innocence. A second innocence, it's not a complete abandonment, self-abandonment. And then you will see the Son and you will not be afraid. So a combination of an acknowledgement that fear is not a good state, and a re-invocation or invocation of the second innocence, and obviously deconstruction of the modality and structures of accusation, unification and love. A grapevine has been planted outside of the Father, but being unsound it will be pulled up by its roots and destroyed. Interesting, I forgot about this. So maybe this is partly why I got my idea about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil having been planted by Lucifer. But anyway, interesting. Always, this sort of thing Jesus says sometimes could have quite sinister, quite fearful connotations. But anyway, I like to interpret it in the way that I did. Whichever one of you comes to be a child will be acquainted with the kingdom and will become superior to John the Baptist, presumably. So this is an interesting one. Again, this invocation of the greatness of the child here, insofar as children are innocent, because they have this pre-accusatory structure and this receptivity to the infinite as well, which you see also reflected in Jesus' talk about how children behold the face of the Father, and the kingdom of heaven belongs to children, which is in the Synoptics. So I'm not suggesting that Jesus is saying here that people should become children again and regress psychologically in a sort of psychotic regression. I had a difference, when I was in New York, I was thinking about the difference between a man-child and a child-man. And a man-child would be this sort of reversion to immaturity, man-child, because the child was the dominant noun and the man is the adjective. So I would prefer the notion of a child-man. Someone who is a man, but they just have childlike as opposed to childish attributes, or not attributes, more like opennesses or receptivities, qualities. It becomes superior to John. John being, well, some people say like Elijah at the time, yeah, but John representing the highest development of what an adult can do within the domain of the fallen world, of the knowledge of good and evil and accusation, this sort of thing. Just my thoughts. If two make peace with each other in this one house, they will say to the mountain, "Move away," and it will move away. Literal, figurative. I think that the interesting question for me here is, we do not know how easy it would be for us to solve our problems if only we were to feel connected, transconnected, reconciled at a deep level in our beings, such as to both not fear one another and also to share our capacities and our resources. So that's, I think, what I would take away from that line of Jesus's. What is the sign of your Father in you? Say to them, it is movement and repose. Lovely, lovely phrase. Movement and repose. but simultaneously. Is it simultaneously, or is it one after the other? Or is it some kind of movement such that in the very movement there is a repose? I mean, I just like the idea that the two qualities of being still and being active can be somehow interconnected and combined. Whoever has come to understand, I think I'm going to pause it here now, sorry, and break it now, because I don't want to lose again what I've just done, okay? Okay, so carry on with the Gospel of Thomas. Just reflections on some of the sayings. Apologies about the quality of the picture from this Windows Live Movie Maker webcam, and perhaps not knowing about the settings and quite what they should be like. But anyway, okay. Who has come to understand the world has found only a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse is superior to the world. Okay, so what is the world and what is the corpse? The world I would understand a little bit like the Matrix in that film, and as a collective hallucination. It's like a system of collective thought that congregates around certain particular ideas, which adults pass on to children. It's a symbolic order, and it's founded in accusation and dualism and division and the knowledge of good and evil, in this sense in which everything is organised around separation. And you could argue that in our eon, in our dispensation of history, it is itself history, stemming back as far as we know. And so the end of the world, although many people seem to think, if we think of films like 2012 and other apocalyptic films, there seems to be the presupposition that the end of the world is a disastrous thing, is a negative thing, whereas I think it's a cause of great celebration and great joy as people, not just individually but collectively and in history and in a demonstrable fashion are reconciled to the infinite, in experience as opposed to in faith, in experience and in visual and palpable experience through the five senses on this earth, not in some other world beyond death. So that would be the end of the world. So who has come to understand the world has found only a corpse. So it's an alarming idea to suggest ambulance, to suggest that the world we live in now is dead. Obviously, there's a kind of metaphorical usage of death going on here in relation to the literal use of death that we have, which relates only to the body. But Jesus talks elsewhere about let the dead bury the dead. So you've got two meanings of the word dead there: spiritually dead and physically dead. So here we're talking about spiritual death, which is not having the presence of life in your heart and in your senses. The presence of spiritual life mediated through the absence of accusation and the presence of love, universal love for all things. So whoever has come to understand the world has found only a corpse, because the world is a place of death, and perhaps this is why we're always wanting to escape the world through love or through art, through certain forms of idealism, sometimes more literally in tragic ways. Okay, so whoever has come to understand the world has found a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse is superior to the world. So the idea that it's possible for there to be people on the earth who are superior to the entire symbolic structural system of public life, and see this corpse and recognise that this is an artificial, contrived reality, and that there is a higher or other. I don't necessarily like the word higher because it tends to depreciate the material, but there is another order of reality that is superior to the world and preceded and will succeed the world as we understand it, and that's the true life. Blessed is the man who has suffered and found life. Interesting here, so one could suggest from this a kind of cult of suffering, fetishization of suffering. You need to suffer. In a sense, suffering is inevitable anyway in this world, as the Buddha says. So we could bring in here the Gurdjieffian concept of the conscious sufferer, a voluntary suffering where one decides to suffer for a particular purpose. And this would, of course, involve behaving in certain ways that would detach yourself from the inevitability of purposeless suffering as well. So a certain life of wisdom and an ethical practice that can mean you don't suffer in certain ways that other people suffer from. Perhaps by following certain moral precepts. And then complementary to that, an additional suffering, which perhaps is being referred to here, is where you take on yourself and your shoulders like Atlas the burdens of the world. And in that you feel a tremendous sense of both meaning and purpose and love for God, but also for life itself. Remember that although God is, of course, happy for us to love God, the purpose ultimately in love is for people to love one another. Because the world, or the earth, I prefer to say, sorry, the earth needs love. God doesn't really need to be loved by his creatures in the same way as God loves as God's love needs to reach his creatures. And how can God's love reach his creatures necessarily if creatures are not loving one another, if they block themselves off to that transmission of love and light? Look for a place for yourself within yourself, lest you become a corpse and be eaten. Okay, so here sort of stressing the virtue of interiority. I would prefer the word interiority to introspection. Introspection makes me think of a cognitive process of obsessing about your cogito, and trying to understand your inner self in your mind. Interiority, rather, one thinks of placing the mind or the self-awareness in the heart and reconciling mind, body and feelings. Find a place for yourself within yourself. So come to peace with yourself. Find a space inside yourself where whatever happens outside yourself, you still have some kind of refuge, some sanctuary. But it's important that this not be a self-fetishizing introspection, which could become a narcissism. And lest you become a corpse and be eaten. So again, so it's going back to the idea that we are living in a world that is self-dead. And one is reminded here I am reminded of Gurdjieff's distinction between evolution, which here he's talking about in spiritual terms, and involution. Involution being retrogression and degradation and being eaten by the moon. Yes. You can read about all that by Gurdjieff. How literal, of course, this is in reality, I don't know. But I like to think of it in terms of just in talking about the moon as an inferior form of life or energy. I don't want to think of the moon as evil. I want to think of the moon as symbolising this order of life that is most distant from God and that therefore needs our love and needs our light. So we should have a relationship with the moon where we're bringing to the moon and everything represented with the lunar the love and the patience and the kindness of the sun and the other suns and the God beyond the sun and blah blah blah. And if we don't do that, then the moon eats us, takes the energy from us one way or the other. So the moon can either get the energy through our intentionality or in alignment with our efforts to bring love to the moon, or the moon, if we're ignoring the moon or not in touch with love for that which is outside ourselves, then the moon will take the energy it needs by eating us, bringing us down to its level. So it's similar to the lion becoming the master of the man as opposed to the man being the master of the lion. And I think of the moon in terms of it being the centre of gravity, both of each individual, but also of the Earth itself. So it's an important thing, the moon, but it's also important that it not operate in a way that means that it takes from us energy without our consent, which it inevitably will do because it needs it. Anyway, that's sort of bringing in some alchemical stuff, and it's just my own ideas, sparked by various things. I realise Jesus is not talking about the moon here. I am he who exists from the undivided. I was given some of the things of my Father. I don't know about this. My understanding of this would be when the first sentence he's talking about second person of the Trinity and the principle of being God. And in the second sentence he's talking about himself as Jesus being given only some of the things of my Father. Being incarnated means that there's always a certain block between being God as a human being and being God in the absolute transcendent, outside of the brain, outside of human body. I mean, Kant would I think Kant would have an interesting thing to say actually to Jesus. It would be interesting if they had a conversation together. I can imagine Jesus perhaps agreeing with Kant that even if he is God and is the incarnation of the infinite, that he can only kind of know even God through the structures of the mind that he was educated within, and the concepts that were germane and natural to the mind at that time, which to a great extent will be similar to our own, space and time and cause and effect, blah blah blah, and particularly, of course, what he's trying to communicate to people, so he packages his words in that way as well. But I think that my point is that if we think that, as I do, if we think that Jesus is God incarnate, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's absolutely no difference between Jesus as God incarnate and God out there, in the quintessential heart of the universe, outside of planet Earth. If he is undivided, he will be filled with light. But if he is divided, he will be filled with darkness. So that's lovely. That's one of my favourites. So undivided, not just mainly within oneself, but perhaps also not divided from other people. Then the light of the God will come in and shine. If you're divided, you're confused and fragmented, then you'll be filled with darkness. But it's important to emphasize here again that by this undividedness, we're not talking about some kind of strenuously enforced imposition upon multiplicity that binds it into a compact and opaque one, and where light cannot get through because there are no cracks. And there's an intense compacted one that is itself oppressive and denies multiplicity. No, it's not undivided in that sense. It's a different kind of undividedness that is itself open and doesn't worry about cracks and doesn't try to overcome multiplicity, but is at ease across the difference within. So you can be undivided in your own multiplicitous nature or multiple nature. So it's really talking about the heart, I think, the heart of love and simplicity, but itself doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't have many different, even fragmented aspects of his own being, and like not necessarily remembering everything at all times, and obviously people behaving in different ways in relation to different people. This is in a sense a fragmentary, a multiplicitous sense of self, and indeed the very openness to others means that one loses a certain ego. So being undivided does not mean having a very self-possessed ego. It means the opposite of that, actually. It's complex stuff, yeah. There's a difference anyway between being divided within oneself and having a multiple self, or a non-unitary self. and division here in undividedness is talking about an attitude of the heart, a simplicity of the heart. Show me this. Blessed are they who have been persecuted within themselves. It is they who have truly come to know the Father. Blessed are the hunger. Okay, I'm sorry. That which you have will save you if you bring it forth from yourself. That which you do not have within you will kill you if you do not have it within you. That which you have will save you if you bring it forth from yourself. I think this is perhaps talking about the imperative to be creative and to share the light that is inside oneself. And if you don't do that, then then there's darkness. And Jesus mentions elsewhere about the light being on the table and shining. And if you don't share what qualities of light you have, or wisdom, or interest that you have, then that's a shame. I think I have to check the second sentence here because I might have mistranscribed it. O man, who has made me a divider. So that's interesting. So remember we talked about the original one, and then Jesus suggesting that men turned the one into a two. Yeah. So there's a tension. Is God saying that I divided you, or is God saying no, you divided yourself? Perhaps this is a later division, where there is already a division, and then we're in the process of the ultimate movement back to the one, and within that process of the ultimate movement back to reconciliation, there needs to be further divisions. Or maybe Jesus is talking about this here in a way that I don't entirely understand, that Jesus is now being a divider, because man himself has set up a divided system. So within that context, division is appropriate as a response. Many are standing at the door, but it is the solitary who will enter the bridal chamber. Now this is interesting because I myself put a lot of emphasis on communality and the collective, the sense of redemption and collective guilt. Whereas here Jesus seems to be emphasising the solitary individualistic approach to God. So what is Jesus talking about here? I think it's what we talked about earlier in response to the world corpse and people who are able to see that. Yeah, and at the moment it's only really individuals, I think, who are really able to transcend and escape the grasp and control of this matrix-like symbolic order in the collective mind. But ultimately, what's interesting, hopefully, in the future, we will live in a world, or a non-world, on Earth. We will live in an Earth, further word Earth, where everyone's in the bridal chamber, still as individuals, but also collectively. Okay, I'll leave that there for today. The rest of them a lot of them are from the synoptics.